The evening sky was painted in shades of orange and purple as Dr. Thompson finished her last rounds at Children's Memorial Hospital. As a pediatric surgeon, she had just completed a challenging 12-hour shift, successfully performing 2 emergency surgeries on young patients. Her dark curly hair was slightly messy from wearing a surgical cap all day, and her eyes carried the weight of dedication that came with saving young lives. The clock on her dashboard read 7:45 p.m. as she pulled out of the hospital parking lot in her navy blue Mercedes SUV. The streets of Atlanta were quieter now, with most of the rush hour traffic having cleared. The peaceful drive gave her time to reflect on her day, especially thinking about the smile on her 6-year-old patient's face when she told him he could go home soon. Rain started to fall softly against her windshield, creating a gentle rhythm that matched the soft jazz playing on her car stereo. She adjusted the wipers and carefully navigated through the well-maintained streets of the suburban neighborhood. The familiar route would take her past the local high school, through 2 roundabouts, and finally to her home in the upscale Oak Ridge community. As she stopped at a red light, she noticed movement in her rearview mirror. A police cruiser had pulled up behind her, its headlights particularly bright in the growing darkness. She didn't think much of it at first. Police patrols were common in this area. But as she turned right onto Maple Avenue, the cruiser followed. She maintained her usual careful driving, making sure to signal every turn and stay exactly at the speed limit. The cruiser stayed close behind her, uncomfortably close. Through her mirror, she could see the officer's silhouette, his face illuminated by the dim blue light of his onboard computer. Block after block, the patrol car remained there, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Her hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but she kept her composure, drawing on years of staying calm under pressure in the operating room. She was just 3 blocks from home when she noticed the cruiser's position had changed. It was now so close she could barely see its headlights in her mirror. Her heart rate picked up slightly, but her face remained composed. She'd been in situations like this before, and experience had taught her to stay professional and collected. The rain was falling harder now, creating sheets of water on her windshield that the wipers barely kept up with. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, creating an almost dreamlike scene. Through the rain-streaked windows of nearby homes, she could see families settling in for dinner, unaware of the tension building on their quiet street. She thought about her husband at home, probably already preparing dinner. He always cooked when she had long surgery days, understanding how draining they could be. She smiled slightly at the thought, but the smile faded as she saw the police cruiser's lights suddenly flash to life, filling her car with alternating bars of blue and red. Her dashboard clock now read 8:03 p.m. She knew the protocol: find a safe place to pull over, turn on interior lights, keep hands visible. As she carefully pulled to the curb, she could see neighbors peering out through their windows, drawn by the flashing lights that now illuminated the rainy night like a silent disco. She took a deep breath, her medical ID badge still hanging around her neck, catching the red and blue flashes. Years of facing challenging situations had taught her to stay calm, to think clearly, to be professional. But as she watched the officer's door open in her side mirror, she couldn't help but think about all the similar situations she'd heard about, all the times when routine traffic stops had gone wrong. The rain continued its steady rhythm on her roof, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at the unusual light show on their typically quiet street. What should have been a simple drive home was about to become something very different. The police officer took his time approaching the Mercedes, his boots splashing through puddles that reflected the spinning lights. Through her side mirror, Dr. Thompson watched him walk with a deliberate slowness that made her stomach tighten. She had already placed her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, interior lights on, engine off, everything by the book. Rain trickled down her driver's side window as the officer rapped on it sharply with his flashlight, harder than necessary. The sound made her flinch slightly, but she maintained her composure as she pressed the button to lower the window. The cold rain immediately started misting into her car. License and registration, the officer demanded without introduction or explanation. His nameplate read Officer Wilson. His face was set in a hard expression, flashlight beam aimed directly at her eyes despite the car's interior lights being on. The light was so bright she had to squint, making it difficult to see his face clearly. "Good evening, officer," she replied calmly, her voice steady from years of handling high-pressure situations. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The rain continued its steady drumming on the car roof, providing a soundtrack to the tense scene. "I said license and registration," he repeated, his tone growing sharper. "You can ask questions after you comply with my orders." His free hand rested near his belt, a posture that seemed unnecessarily aggressive for a routine traffic stop. Dr. Thompson nodded slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and visible. "I'm going to reach for my purse in the passenger seat to get my license," she explained clearly. The officer's flashlight followed her movements as she carefully retrieved her wallet. Her hospital ID badge caught the beam of light, the photo clearly showing her in surgical scrubs. "This vehicle seems a bit expensive for this neighborhood," Officer Wilson commented as he examined her license, his tone carrying an unmistakable implication. "Is this your car, or are you borrowing it from someone?" The question hung in the rain-filled air like an accusation. Dr. Thompson felt her chest tighten, but her voice remained professional. "This is my vehicle, officer. I'm a pediatric surgeon at Children's Memorial Hospital, just finishing my shift. I live 3 blocks from here in Oak Ridge." The officer's skepticism was palpable as he looked from the license to her face and back again. "Sure you do. And I'm the chief of surgery." His sarcasm cut through the night air. "Step out of the vehicle." "Officer Wilson, I don't understand. I haven't violated any traffic laws. Could you please explain why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle in the rain?" Her heart was beating faster now, but her doctor's training kept her voice steady and reasonable. A couple had emerged from their house across the street, standing under an umbrella, watching the scene unfold. More faces appeared in nearby windows, drawn by the flashing lights and the growing tension on their usually quiet street. "Ma'am, when I tell you to exit the vehicle, that's not a request. That's an order." His hand moved to rest on his belt again, a gesture that made the watching neighbors shift uncomfortably. "And you don't want to disobey a direct order, do you?" Dr. Thompson glanced at her phone sitting in the cup holder. One press of a button would connect her to her husband, but she knew reaching for it now could escalate the situation. The rain was coming down harder, the sound almost drowning out the idle of the police cruiser's engine behind her. "Officer," she tried once more, her voice clear and controlled, "I'm happy to cooperate, but I'd like to understand the reason for this stop. I have the right to know why I'm being detained." Her medical training had taught her to always document everything, and she was mentally recording every detail of this encounter. The officer's face hardened further. "Out of their vehicle. Now." Each word was clipped and harsh. "And keep your hands where I can see them." His flashlight beam never wavered from her face, the harsh light creating shadows that made the scene feel even more surreal. More neighbors had gathered now, some holding up phones, recording the interaction. The air was thick with tension and the smell of wet pavement. A distant roll of thunder added to the growing drama of the moment. Dr. Thompson knew she had a choice to make. Years of handling critical situations in the operating room had taught her to think clearly under pressure. She could feel the weight of her phone in the cup holder, knowing that one call would change everything about this encounter. But first, she would try one more time to handle this professionally. The car door opened with a soft click as Dr. Thompson carefully stepped out into the rain. Her hospital scrubs were visible under her coat, and her surgery department ID badge still hung around her neck. The rain quickly began soaking through her clothes, but she kept her movements slow and deliberate, hands clearly visible at all times. "Put your hands on the hood," Officer Wilson commanded, his flashlight beam now joined by a second officer who had pulled up quietly during their interaction. The new patrol car's lights added to the swirling display of red and blue that illuminated the wet street. "Officer, I want to comply, but I need to understand what's happening here," Dr. Thompson said, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used when explaining complicated procedures to worried parents. "I've broken no laws, and I'm literally standing in the rain just blocks from my home." The growing crowd of neighbors had swelled to about a dozen people now, many holding umbrellas and phones. The whispers and murmurs grew louder as Officer Wilson took a step closer, his hand still resting near his belt. "Ma'am, your attitude is making this situation more difficult than it needs to be," he said, ignoring her reasonable request for explanation. I've got reports of suspicious vehicles in this area, and your car matches a description. A neighbor from 2 houses down, still in his business suit, stepped forward. That's ridiculous, she lives here. We see her drive by every day. His voice carried the frustration that many onlookers were feeling. Sir, step back or you'll be interfering with a police investigation, the second officer called out, moving to create a wider perimeter around the scene. The neighbor reluctantly stepped back, but kept his phone raised, recording. Dr. Thompson stood her ground, rain dripping from her curly hair onto her shoulders. Officer Wilson, I'm going to reach into my coat pocket and show you something, she said clearly, making sure her voice could be heard by all the witnesses. It's my hospital ID and business card. Don't move. Wilson's voice sharp enough to make several observers jump. Keep your hands where they are. The absurdity of the situation was becoming more apparent to everyone watching. Here was a woman in surgical scrubs with a hospital ID badge being treated like a dangerous criminal. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, more phones appeared, recording the scene. My patient today was a 6-year-old boy with appendicitis, Dr. Thompson said, her voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. I spent 6 hours in surgery saving his life. I have another surgery scheduled tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. I'm standing in the rain right now instead of having dinner with my husband, and I still don't know why I was pulled over. A few drops of rain ran down Officer Wilson's face as he processed her words. His flashlight beam wavered slightly, but his stance remained aggressive. If you live here, prove it. Where's your proof of residence? It's in my glove compartment with my registration, which you haven't asked to see yet, she replied, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the ridiculous situation. Would you like me to get it now? Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now, as if nature itself was commenting on the tension of the moment. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that the situation was spiraling away from a routine traffic stop into something that would require a lot of paperwork and explanations. One of the neighbors had walked onto their front porch and was now openly filming with a professional-looking camera. Another had pulled out a tablet, apparently looking something up. The crowd's whispers grew more distinct. That's the surgeon from Children's. She saved my nephew last year. This is completely out of line. Officer Wilson's radio crackled to life, breaking the tension momentarily. He kept his eyes on Dr. Thompson as he responded to some routine check, but something had changed in his demeanor. Perhaps it was the gathering crowd, or the multiple cameras recording, or maybe just the absurdity of a surgeon in scrubs being treated as a suspicious person. Dr. Thompson felt her phone vibrating in her pocket, probably her husband wondering why she wasn't home yet. The rain had soaked through her scrubs now, and she could feel the cold seeping in, but her stance remained dignified and professional. She had handled high-pressure situations in the operating room for years. She could handle this moment of injustice with the same grace and composure. "Officer," she said, her voice clear and measured, "I'm going to reach for my phone now. My husband needs to know why I'm standing in the rain instead of having dinner." She moved her hand slowly, deliberately, knowing that this simple action would change the entire dynamic of the situation. Dr. Thompson's fingers wrapped around her phone, the screen illuminated with missed calls from her husband. Officer Wilson tensed visibly, but she kept her movements slow and clear. The rain continued its steady drumbeat on the pavement as she pressed the speed dial, putting the phone on speaker so everyone could hear. "Honey, I need you right now," she said, her voice steady but carrying an urgency that made the gathering crowd lean in closer. "I'm 3 blocks from home, being held in the rain by 2 officers, no explanation given." She carefully recited the intersection name, knowing her husband would understand the gravity of the situation immediately. Officer Wilson's face flickered with uncertainty for the first time. "Ma'am, you don't need to make any calls. We can handle this situation right here." "My husband needs to know where I am," she replied calmly, still holding the phone. "And as Assistant Special Agent in charge of the FBI's Atlanta field office, he needs to know why his wife is being detained without cause." The effect was immediate. The second officer's posture changed noticeably, and several onlookers murmured in surprise. Officer Wilson's flashlight beam wavered slightly, but he tried to maintain his authoritative stance. "That's a pretty convenient claim," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier swagger. anyone can say they're connected to the FBI. Through the phone speaker, a deep voice responded, "I'm already on my way. Stay calm, keep your hands visible, and don't move. I'll be there in 3 minutes." The authority in the voice was unmistakable. The atmosphere on the street shifted dramatically. Neighbors who had been recording now moved closer, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. The rain seemed to fall harder, creating a curtain of water that reflected the still flashing police lights. "Officer Wilson," Dr. Thompson said quietly, "I've cooperated fully with your unfounded investigation. I've maintained my composure while being treated like a criminal. Now I suggest you radio your supervisor, because this situation is about to become much more complicated than a routine traffic stop." As if on cue, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching cut through the rain. 3 unmarked black SUVs turned onto the street, their emergency lights now adding to the light show. They moved with precision, positioning themselves strategically around the scene. The neighbors watched in amazement as the vehicles smoothly surrounded the area. From the lead SUV emerged a tall man in a tactical FBI windbreaker, his badge clearly visible even in the rain. 2 more agents emerged from each of the other vehicles, moving with practiced efficiency. Officer Wilson's hand dropped from his belt as he watched the FBI agents approach. His partner had already taken several steps back, clearly recognizing the gravity of the situation. The crowd of neighbors had grown even larger, despite the rain, as word spread about what was happening on their quiet street. "I'm Assistant Special Agent in charge of the FBI's Atlanta field office," the tall man announced, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. He held up his credentials, which gleamed in the mix of emergency lights. "Would someone like to explain why my wife is standing in the rain?" The second officer quickly stepped forward. "Sir, there seems to be a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Dr. Thompson's husband cut him off, his voice controlled but intense. "I'd say racial profiling and civil rights violations are a bit more serious than a misunderstanding, wouldn't you?" Officer Wilson's face had lost all color. The flashlight that had been so aggressively pointed at Dr. Thompson now hung limply at his side. The gathered neighbors watched as more FBI agents positioned themselves around the scene, some already taking statements from witnesses. "I want both officers' badge numbers, your supervisor's contact information, and a full explanation of the probable cause for this stop," the FBI agent continued, pulling out a small notebook. The rain had plastered his shirt to his shoulders, but he seemed not to notice. "And I want them now." Thunder rolled overhead, punctuating his words. The neighbors who had been recording everything now moved forward, eager to share their videos with the FBI agents. Each flash of lightning revealed more details of the scene. Officer Wilson's now uncertain stance, the second officer's apologetic expression, and Dr. Thompson's dignified composure despite her drenched scrubs. One of the FBI agents had already retrieved an umbrella from their vehicle and held it over Dr. Thompson, while another was examining the police cruiser's dash cam. The professional efficiency of the federal agents stood in stark contrast to the earlier chaos of the traffic stop. Within minutes, the quiet suburban street had transformed into what looked like a scene from a police procedural. The FBI assistant special agent in charge stood in the rain, his presence commanding attention from everyone present. His team moved with practiced precision, their actions clearly showing years of professional training. First, he addressed the local officers, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "I want to know why an accomplished surgeon was pulled over 3 blocks from her home." He held up his credentials again, making sure the gathering crowd could see them clearly in the flashing lights. "And then we'll discuss the complete absence of probable cause for this stop." A police supervisor's car pulled up, lights flashing but siren silent. The sergeant stepped out, quickly assessing the situation. His face showed immediate concern as he took in the FBI presence and the crowd of witnesses with recording phones. "I received a call about a situation here," the sergeant said, approaching with professional caution. The FBI agent nodded, maintaining his commanding presence. "Your officers conducted an unlawful stop of my wife, a chief pediatric surgeon at Children's Memorial, with no probable cause," the FBI agent explained, his voice level but intense. "She was ordered out of her vehicle in the rain and treated like a criminal, despite showing her hospital ID and explaining her profession." The sergeant turned to Officer Wilson, who was now standing awkwardly in the rain. Is this true? What was your probable cause for the stop? Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably. We had reports of suspicious vehicles in the area. His voice trailed off as he realized how weak this justification sounded. A suspicious vehicle? The FBI agent's voice cut through the rain. You mean a legally owned Mercedes SUV driven by a medical professional in surgical scrubs with a hospital ID badge? Is that what counts as suspicious in this neighborhood? One of the FBI agents approached with a tablet, showing footage from nearby security cameras that had captured the entire incident. The sergeant watched the footage, his expression growing more concerned with each passing moment. I want every report filed by Officer Wilson for the past 6 months, the FBI agent continued. Every traffic stop, every interaction. My team will be conducting a thorough review for patterns of behavior. His words carried the clear implication that this wasn't the first such incident. The neighbors who had been recording everything now stepped forward, eager to provide their statements. A retired judge from 2 houses down spoke up. We've lived here for 15 years. The doctor and her husband are respected members of our community. This kind of harassment is unacceptable. Dr. Thompson, still standing dignified despite her rain-soaked scrubs, finally spoke. I want to be clear about something, she said, her voice carrying the same authority she used in the operating room. This isn't just about me. How many other professionals of color have been stopped without cause? How many without an FBI agent for a spouse to call? The FBI agents had set up a temporary shelter using tactical umbrellas, creating a dry space for taking witness statements. One agent was already reviewing Officer Wilson's dash cam footage, while another photographed the scene and documented the positions of all vehicles involved. Your body cameras were on, correct? The FBI agent asked the local officers, though it wasn't really a question. We'll need that footage preserved immediately. No delays, no technical difficulties. The emphasis on those last words made it clear he was familiar with how some departments handled unfavorable footage. The sergeant, recognizing the severity of the situation, had already called for internal affairs. Both officers will be placed on administrative duty pending a full investigation, he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. We take these allegations very seriously. The rain had begun to ease, but the tension in the air remained thick. The FBI agent turned to the gathered neighbors, his demeanor shifting slightly. Thank you all for being here, for recording, for bearing witness. Your involvement matters. This is how change happens, when communities stand up and say enough. Dr. Thompson's phone buzzed again, the hospital calling about tomorrow's surgery. Even in this situation, her patients came first. I need to take this, she said. I have a 7-year-old who needs heart surgery in the morning. The contrast between her dedication to saving lives and how she'd been treated wasn't lost on anyone present. As she stepped aside to take the call, the FBI agent continued organizing the scene. Evidence was being collected, statements taken, and proper procedures followed. This incident wouldn't be swept under the rug or dismissed with a simple apology. It would be thoroughly investigated, documented, and used to drive real change in department policies. The next morning, while Dr. Thompson was performing life-saving surgery on her young patient, the wheels of justice were already turning. The Internal Affairs Office had been buzzing since dawn, with investigators poring over Officer Wilson's record. What they found painted a disturbing picture that couldn't be ignored. The investigation room walls were covered with data, maps showing traffic stop locations, charts displaying racial demographics of drivers stopped, and timestamps of incidents. One investigator, a veteran with 20 years of experience, shook her head as she reviewed the body camera footage from the previous night. Look at this pattern, she pointed to a map dotted with red pins. Over 80% of his suspicious vehicle stops were of minority drivers in upscale neighborhoods. Not one of these stops resulted in an arrest or discovery of any criminal activity. Her colleague nodded grimly, adding another pin to the growing cluster. Down the hall, 2 FBI analysts were cross-referencing complaints filed against Officer Wilson over the past 3 years. Many had been dismissed or buried in paperwork, but now each one was being carefully re-examined. The stories showed a clear pattern: professionals of color being stopped, questioned, and treated with suspicion while going about their daily lives. Here's another one, an analyst called out, holding up a file. a black business executive in his own driveway, accused of stealing his own car. The complaint was filed, but no action was taken. He added the incident to a growing spreadsheet that would become part of the official report. The police chief called an emergency meeting with department heads. The conference room was tense as they reviewed the preliminary findings. "This isn't just about one incident or one officer," the chief stated firmly. "This is about systemic issues that we need to address head-on." Meanwhile, the local news had picked up the story. Citizen videos of the incident had gone viral overnight. The comment sections were flooded with similar stories from other professionals who had faced similar treatment. A local civil rights attorney appeared on the morning news, explaining the broader implications of the case. "What makes this case significant," the attorney explained to the cameras, "is not just that it happened to a surgeon married to an FBI agent. It's that it highlights what happens every day to countless others who don't have that kind of backup to call." Back at the police department, Officer Wilson sat in a small office, reviewing his own body camera footage with his union representative. His face showed the dawning realization of how his actions would be perceived by the public. The rain on his windshield last night had obscured a hospital parking permit and a medical caduceus sticker, details that should have been obvious. By afternoon, community leaders had gathered at City Hall. The meeting room was packed with concerned citizens, civil rights advocates, and police reform specialists. The discussion wasn't just about punishment, it was about prevention and systemic change. "We need better training," one community leader emphasized. "But more importantly, we need accountability. Every stop, every interaction should be documented and reviewed. No more swept under the rug complaints." The police department's training coordinator was already revising protocols, adding new scenarios based on recent incidents. "We're implementing immediate changes," she explained to the oversight committee. "Every officer will undergo enhanced bias recognition training, and our stop procedures are being completely overhauled." Social media continued to buzz with the story. #DrivingMileBlack was trending again, with thousands sharing their own experiences. Local college students organized a peaceful rally, carrying signs that read, "Protect all communities," and "Badge bias." In her office at the hospital, between surgeries, Dr. Thompson received countless messages of support from colleagues and former patients. But she wasn't interested in personal attention. Instead, she was working with her husband to draft a proposal for a new police community oversight committee. "This has to be about meaningful change," she told the hospital board during their emergency meeting. "We have staff members who face this kind of treatment regularly. We need to protect not just our doctors, but our nurses, our technicians, our cleaning staff. Everyone deserves to drive home safely." The internal affairs investigation moved with unprecedented speed, fueled by public attention and the FBI's involvement. Each revelation added to a picture of systemic issues that could no longer be ignored. The department's leadership knew they were at a turning point. This incident would either be a catalyst for real change or a glaring example of institutional failure. 6 months after that rainy night, the police training center's main classroom was packed with officers. On the screen at the front of the room, body camera footage played, the now famous traffic stop that had changed department policy. But this time, something was different. The surgeon herself stood at the podium, sharing her perspective on that night. "I'm not here to shame anyone," Dr. Thompson began, her voice carrying the same steady confidence she brought to the operating room. "I'm here because we all want the same thing. A safer community where everyone is treated with respect." The room of officers, initially tense, began to relax as she spoke. The FBI assistant special agent in charge, her husband, stood at the back of the room, watching as his wife turned a traumatic experience into a teaching moment. Officer Wilson, now back on duty after extensive retraining, sat in the front row. His face showed the impact of the past month's learning and reflection. "When I'm in surgery," Dr. Thompson continued, gesturing to photos of her work with young patients, "I don't see color. I see human beings who need help. That's what we all should see when we look at each other." Several officers nodded in agreement. The changes in the department were already showing results. New protocols required officers to clearly state the reason for every traffic stop before approaching vehicles. Body cameras had to be activated before any citizen interaction, and monthly reviews of stop data looked for potential bias patterns. In the community, the impact was even more visible. The new Civilian Oversight Committee, born from that incident, had become a model for other cities. Regular meetings between police and community leaders had built bridges that many thought impossible just months ago. "Look at these numbers," the police chief announced at a town hall meeting, pointing to a screen of statistics. "Traffic stops are down 30%, but our crime-solving rate is up. When we focus on real suspicious activity instead of biased assumptions, everyone benefits." The hospital where Dr. Thompson worked had also stepped up. They created a support system for staff members who experienced discrimination, and their ID badges now included QR codes that could quickly verify employment status. Other hospitals across the country were adopting similar measures. Officer Wilson's transformation became part of the story too. Instead of being fired, he'd chosen to become part of the solution. He now helped train other officers about recognizing and overcoming bias, sharing his own journey of understanding. "I thought I was doing my job," he told a group of new recruits. "But I was letting assumptions cloud my judgment. Real police work isn't about acting on hunches based on how someone looks. It's about protecting and serving everyone equally." The FBI team that had responded that night had also created a new rapid response protocol for civil rights violations. Other field offices across the country were implementing similar programs, ensuring that such incidents received immediate attention. In the neighborhood where it all happened, something remarkable occurred. The annual block party, once a small affair, had grown into a community unity celebration. Police officers, medical staff, and residents all attended, sharing food and stories, breaking down the barriers that had once seemed so high. Dr. Thompson's young patients and their families noticed the change too. Children of color no longer whispered anxiously about police cars in the hospital parking lot. Instead, they saw officers who regularly visited the pediatric ward, bringing stuffed animals and friendly smiles. The retired judge who had witnessed the original incident now headed the Civilian Oversight Committee. "What happened that night was wrong," he often said, "but how we responded as a community was right. We didn't let anger divide us, we let it drive us toward positive change." At a national law enforcement conference, the incident became a case study in how to transform a potential tragedy into institutional improvement. Departments from across the country sent representatives to learn from what had happened. Dr. Thompson and her husband continued their regular lives, she saving lives in the operating room, he protecting citizens through his FBI work. But they had added a new mission, speaking at police academies and community forums, sharing their story to promote understanding and change. "The measure of a community," Dr. Thompson told a graduating class of police cadets, "isn't that we never make mistakes. It's how we learn from them and grow stronger together." The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was the sound of real change taking root.